Little side bit of information. Okay, I want to move on to some other crops. Let me tell you just one more thing about planting tomatoes. Plant a bunch of different varieties. In any given year, one variety may do extremely well, another variety may do extremely poorly. Plant a bunch of different varieties and put the names on the cages so that you remember which one did really well. But if you plant 25 celebrity tomatoes, you may have the best tomato crop in the world. But if it's a bad year for celebrities, you're not going to have any. I probably will not plant as many tomatoes as usual because we're under such severe water restrictions where I live. But I normally plant about 40 cages or so of tomatoes, and I'll plant at least 20 different varieties. I don't care how many you plant. If you're only planting 6 plants, plant 4 different varieties so that you will have a variety of things that produce both in hot and chillier weather. And just every year, don't write a plant off. If a plant produces poorly for 2 or 3 years in a row, then you can probably say, well, that variety's no good, don't plant it again. But never judge a tomato on 1 year's performance. Now, there are a lot of new hybrids out there. There are a lot of what we call heirloom varieties out there. Plant some of each. Heirlooms are nice in that you can save the seed and they'll come back the same year after year. Heirlooms are nice in that many times they have better flavor and they have better nutrition. Problem with some heirlooms. Let's take Brandywine, for instance. Brandywine is a big tomato, and talk about a tomato that tastes good. What they say about Brandywines is a Brandywine is what every tomato wants to taste like. But if I plant a Brandywine and a celebrity side by side, I'll get 8 tomatoes off the celebrity for every 1 that I get off the Brandywine. So some of the heirlooms don't produce as much fruit as some of the others. But plant a variety and keep records. If you heard me talking to Howard Garrett this morning, I was telling him one of the smartest things I did. I wish it was my idea, but I don't remember where I stole the idea. I think like Bruce Dooley says, the first 3 times I talk about a good idea that I got from somebody else, it's their idea. By the 4th time, it's my idea, and I'll take full credit for it. But I took an old rural mailbox, put it on a post, and sunk it in the ground at the edge of my vegetable garden. My pruning shears stay there, my garden gloves stay there, and a little journal that I can make notes on stay there. It's the greatest way to have a waterproof thing out by your vegetable garden where you can leave things. But keep notes, keep records, and you'll do much, much better. Yes, sir? No, I like celebrity very much. I don't like bush celebrity because bush celebrity is a determinant, and I don't grow many determinants. But I like regular celebrity. I'm not going to tell you which are the best varieties, but because there are too many good ones out there. But I'll plant some yellow tomatoes. I think yellow tomatoes are sweeter, but don't ever can with yellow tomatoes. Yellow tomatoes are low acid tomatoes, and with low acid things, you run an increased risk of botulism if you don't do it right. So grow some yellow tomatoes, but eat them fresh. And sometime I'll give you my recipe for tomatoes and basil and vinegar and balsamic vinegar and olive oil. I've had offers of marriage based on that. Anyway, enough about tomatoes. I want to move on and talk about a few other crops. If you like squash, you should definitely grow squash. But I want to talk about 2 or 3 different things about growing squash. First of all, we have what we call winter squash and what we have summer squash. You don't grow winter squash in the winter. That's the first most common misconception people have. The difference in winter squash and summer squash is how long it takes the squash to produce. Summer squash include things like zucchini, like the crookneck and straight neck yellow squash, like the patty pan squash or bush scallop they call it, look like little flying saucers. Those are all summer squash. And they produce very quickly, 45 to 55 days, you'll start picking squash from them. If you choose to grow winter squash, which includes the hubbard and the acorn and the butternut and the spaghetti, all that kind of squash, they take 3 times as long. It probably will be 150 days or 165 days before you get squash from those plants. So up north where they have a shorter growing season, they plant them at the same time and they pick their summer squash in early summer and they pick their winter squash in the fall just before winter. They don't grow in the winter. Squash freeze. So, you plant them at the same time. The difference is one of them produces much, much more quickly than the other. Now, The way that I plant squash, I told you how I did the little mound with the compost and the fertilizer and all for the individual tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. I do the same thing, but just on a bigger scale. I'll make a mound that's like this big around where I'm going to plant squash. Scoop out the middle, water it a few times. When I'm ready to plant, I'll put about 6 seeds in that mound. And every one of my squash mounds, I'll give it about this much room because that's how big the squash is going to grow. But from 10 mounds, I'll pick 30 pounds of squash a day. You will get a lot of squash if you grow squash. And the other thing, for those of you who are first-time gardeners, it is not a contest to see who can grow the biggest squash. Squash are delicious when they are small. And don't come in bragging because you got a zucchini that was this long. Anybody can do that. You're not special just because you grew a baseball bat zucchini. And they will get big, but they're a whole lot better to eat when they are small. Squash may get a problem with mildew. Again, that plant wash or the corn water tea, these are great things to stop mildew on squash and cucumbers. A couple of other things about squash and cucumbers. Let's combine those two together. And by the way, cucumbers are vines. They want something to grow on. They can grow up a tomato cage and grow up a fence or something like that. But when they start to bloom, the male blooms and the female blooms are separate. If you look at the blooms, they're totally different. The female bloom, you'll see what they call the pistil down inside of it, which is the female surface that the pollen lands on that ends up developing into a squash. The male flower will be just fuzzy yellow down in the middle. The stamen produce large amounts of pollen. If you ever watch bees working around squash plant, the bee goes in the flower, it looks like a bee, comes out, looks like a puff of pollen. They just get so coated with it. Squash and cucumbers both. The first several flowers that come out are male flowers, pollen only. They can't make fruit any more than you gentlemen can have a baby. So don't be calling me and saying, my squash are blooming but they're not making squash. That's the early blooms. That's the male flowers. Be patient. By the time you get 5 or 6 flowers down the vine, they'll be the female flowers, and you'll wonder why you ever complained. You'll have more squash than you know what to do with. And the same thing's true with cucumbers. But now tomatoes are wind pollinated. This pollen simply falls from the stamen down on the pistil and you get tomatoes. Squash and cucumbers are insect pollinated, so you need to encourage your bees. Don't ever spray or do anything that's harmful to bees or you won't get production on squash and cucumbers. And cucumbers, if your cucumber starts to develop and then it's like the end gets real skinny and shrivels up, it didn't get well pollinated. It didn't have enough pollen grains to make that whole big column of seed down the middle, so the end of it shriveled up. Same thing may be true in squash. So do everything you can to encourage bees. If you want to bring more of them into the garden, take a plant saucer, take some honey, not sugar water, not, people talk about this horrible problem with the honeybees. I think a large amount of it is caused by people that haul the beehives around. Bees make honey. Did they make honey for us? No, they make honey because that's what they eat on in the winter months when there are no flowers out there. So these guys that think they can put their beehives in a semi, haul them to California, and feed them high fructose corn syrup along the way, no wonder the colony falls apart. If you want to bring bees into your garden, make a mixture of honey and water, about 4 parts water to 1 part honey, put it out in a plant saucer, float a sponge in it so the bees can get to it without drowning. You'll be amazed how many honeybees you suddenly have in the garden, and you need that for squash and cucumbers. Now, 2 other quick things on squash.
What was the ratio, Bob?
4 parts water, 1 part honey.
Is there a problem with attracting the Africanized bees when you do that?
Africanized bees aren't a problem unless you're around their colony. Africanized bees are not aggressive when they're out foraging. But you go and disturb their colony, you got big problems. But,
If you set this honey thing out, will it attract them?
It'll attract all bees, but not any more so than they would be around otherwise. This guy right here that looks like a wasp, this little thing right here with the orange body and the dark wings, that's not a wasp, that's a moth. And that's one of the few moths that I really hate because that's the adult form of the squash vine borer. And you'll see these guys around your squash. And what they're going to do is where your squash plant first comes up out of the ground, they're going to lay eggs on that point, and they're going to hatch into a worm that crawls down and hollows out your squash vine and causes it to just totally collapse. That is the squash vine borer. And I used to say that, you know, you never saw it in big gardens, you only saw it in small gardens. I had a real problem with it in my garden last year. If you see those little guys, kill them on sight. What I normally do when I'm worried about squash vine borers, this is a totally non-toxic product that kills caterpillars of all sorts, called dipel dust or dipple dust, I don't know which it is. I'm always putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. But this